One of the biggest misconceptions in American politics is the difference between the deficit and the debt. Now, these terms are often used interchangeably in political rhetoric. However, they technically mean two very different things and therefore address two very separate issues. Specifically, the U.S. national deficit refers to the amount of money that the U.S. federal government goes over budget with accords to the amount of money they have to spend on various different programs. So, for example, if the US government has $20 trillion in revenue, or in tax revenue, the amount of money they have to spend on various different federal initiatives, on various different programs, if they spend $21 trillion, that means that they are $1 trillion over budget. They're in a $1 trillion deficit. Now, the way the American financial system works is a little peculiar because one could make the argument that there actually is no such thing as a deficit technically, because the US centrally plans its currency, meaning it produces dollar bills and money in the Federal Reserve. Therefore, when the government spends money on a particular program, such as Medicare, Social Security, the police, the military, anything, what it is effectively doing is printing money to actually spend on those programs. There's no U.S. central bank where everyone's tax money is, and that whenever they want to spend money on a program, they just pull money out of there and spend it. What tax revenue is supposed to be for, in effect, is to basically curb inflation. Because if you just keep printing money to spend on a particular program, the value of money will massively decrease, and you'd go into hyperinflation to where costs would soar to ungodly rates and no one would be able to buy anything. Therefore, what a deficit kind of really refers to is spending over the amount of money that would cause devastating inflation. What $20 trillion refers to is the amount of tax revenue that if you go over it to a massive extent, it would ultimately result in raising prices unless taxes are increased in turn. Now, there are many different beliefs on how to actually tackle the US national deficit, as many centrists and moderate conservatives believe in a task called balancing the budget, or basically the idea that the amount the government spends on programs should be balanced with the amount of money it receives in tax revenue. Basically, the US government should not go over the budget given to it or limited to it by tax revenue. However, this notion has been challenged by various different political groups, including many on the left and even many conservatives on the far right, who believe that technically deficits can actually pay for themselves. One of the fundamental elements of Keynesian economics is that technically it's actually good to go into a deficit, to engage in deficit spending, where you intentionally spend more money than you have in your budget, because what will happen is that even though in the very beginning you'll be over budget, if you spend it on a particular program, such as healthcare costs or an infrastructure investment, you'll ultimately allow for the consumer class to have more income because you're giving them a program that either gives them money directly or limits the amount of money they have to spend on everyday expenses. So they'll have more money in savings to invest in the economy, and as a result, the revenue of the economy will increase, and therefore the amount of revenue taxed from the economy will also increase. And over a certain amount of time, the deficit will actually pay for itself. Now, the conservative alternative to this is that technically you can pass massive tax cuts without seriously cutting programs or being concerned about increasing the deficit. Because if you pass tax cuts, basically businesses will be able to expand, the American consumer will have more money to spend, in revenue, and therefore the economy will expand as well, and once again, there'll be more tax revenue to use to cover the deficit. Now, another looming issue in the American political system is the U.S. national debt. Now, the national debt refers to a problem where the U.S. is currently $22 trillion in debt to another country or to another outside entity, basically to pay for various different programs outside the realm of deficits, printing money, or tax revenue. The U.S. government has actually borrowed money on interest to banks, countries, and various different outside entities. Now, the debt is not necessarily as much of an issue because that's just a matter of paying it off over a certain amount of time, but it is a considerable crisis to some because it means that we could potentially owe money to some relatively shady sources. As in order to finance the war in Iraq in 2002, the US borrowed billions of dollars from Wall Street banks in order to pay for it without massively increasing taxes or going into rigorous debts or deficit spending. On top of this, the US government has also had to go into massive debt to finance a trade deficit or amount of money we owe to China, Mexico, and other countries as the result of the US sending much of its manufacturing over to those countries. Overall, the national debt and the national deficit are two very different issues, but ones that are both equally important to understand.